when you're writing your first draft, there's a tendency to describe every character in the same way. It's a little, we get into the checklists, the 7 things, the cuteness factor, the height, the weight, the eye color, almost all of which is meaningless and should be left out in the rewrite. But what is it you want to reveal about that character? Find a thing or a behavior that will reveal it, or that actually seems to contradict it. Because revealing that it's a contradiction, that you misunderstood so-and-so because of the thing that was pinned to their hat, that it's a tiny little plot thing, but it's revelatory. Everything you put in the story should mean something.
Hello, fellow creative voyagers. This week on the Indy Author Podcast, I talk with satirist, writer, and poet Timons Esaias about the secret of world building. It's the small stuff. Timons shares his insights into effective world building for fiction, emphasizing the importance of small, non-generic details that enhance character development and scene setting. He touches on the difference between immersive storytelling and simpler narratives, and offers practical tips on how to gather and use unique details from ephemera, old books, and postcards to enrich a narrative. He offers guidance on balancing research with storytelling and on knowing when to stop. And a quick request before we get to the interview: if you've gotten value from the podcast, please consider supporting it and all the work I do by becoming a patron at patreon.com/the Indy Author, and that's Indy with a Y. And now let's hear from Timons Esaias about the secrets of world building. It's the small stuff. Hello, and welcome to the Indy Author Podcast. Today, my guest is Timons Esaias. Hey, Timons, how are you doing?
Reasonably well. How are you?
Good, good. To give our listeners and viewers a little bit of background on you, Timons Esaias is a satirist, writer, and poet living in Pittsburgh. His works, ranging from literary to genre, have been published in 22 languages. He's been a finalist for the British Science Fiction Award, and he has won the Winter Anthony Contest, the SFPA Poetry Contest, and the Asimov's Reader Award twice. He is a recent Pushcart nominee and Intrepid Award winner for the story To Do. His poetry collection is Why Elephants No Longer Communicate in Greek, and he collects chess sets. I met Timons when we were both at the Pen Writers Conference, and I went to Timons' talk about setting and world building inspiration for the small stuff. And I enjoyed it so much, I asked him to come on the podcast to talk about it more. And interestingly, right before we started recording, I asked Timons to just confirm for me the pronunciation of his last name. And he started telling the story, and then I stopped him because I said, I think this is going to be a perfect example of exactly the kind of thing we want to talk about. So, Timons, please continue with the interesting story you started telling me about the origin of your last name.
Yeah, it is a Welsh family name. There are not that many Esaiases, and most of them came over to the States, but they're from South Wales. And it's pretty clear that what they did when they needed a last name was to open a Welsh Bible to the middle and go, and they were in Isaiah, and this is the Welsh form of Isaiah. The Welsh did not have last names until late in the 1800s, when British administration required it, which is why so many Welsh folks are Jones or David or Brown, because Jones is actually John in Welsh. They used patronymics, so-and-so op so-and-so. So Rees was a common first name, so it became a common last name in Wales. If you were the son of John, you became Jones. If you were the son of Brian, you became Brown. And apparently my lineal ascendant needed a last name in the 1600s, and that's when Esaias appears, and we're sure it came out of the Bible. So, and you were also asking about pronunciation, and my bit of the family says Esaias, but there's somebody in the family who says it any way you would think of pronouncing it.
That's very cool. And the reason I think that was so appropriate, wanted to ask you to share that with listeners, is that one of the things, the focus of your conversation about world building was finding these kind of small details that can really lend a lot of color, set the stage for the story that you want to tell. And so we want to talk a little bit about things. Let's start out with things you find missing in settings. What do you wish you saw more of?
Pretty much anything non-generic, just an example, and it was an exercise that I would give my students at Seton Hill who were about to write an entire novel, and they would be meeting with me for the first time. And I would ask them about the adornments that they had on at our meeting, the rings, the necklaces, earrings, whatever. And they didn't have to answer, but why are you wearing that? What's the story behind it? Because one of the things I find missing in fiction is anybody wearing anything and any story behind it. There is very little jewelry in fiction. And we tend to wear things to tell something about ourselves, even if the people won't know what it means, right?
Yeah.
But except for kings and princes and princesses, we leave that out of fiction. That's the kind of thing.
I'm curious as to how you would work that into a fictional work. So, for example, I have a silver Marine Corps bracelet that belonged to my father. Unfortunately, I don't have it on at this very moment, but normally, especially if I go to a writing event, because my father was a writer, I'll wear it. And I think that's exactly the kind of thing. Nobody else may know why I'm doing that. But how would you work that into a story? If you're doing it in first person, then you can say, I put the bracelet on because I wanted my father to be there in spirit with me or something like that. But does that depend on the story being in first person, or is there a way you can work that in
Um,
unawkwardly in a different scenario?
um, there are all sorts of things you can do, and if you're going to have it in the story, it needs to have a meaning, right? And so one of the things, so you've got that bracelet. It reminds me of I'm a naval history fan, and I've gone to museum ships and I've bought the blue baseball caps, and I can't wear them because people keep thanking me for my service,
Yeah,
like I served on the Constitution, right?
yeah.
Um, Old, not that old. Though, of course, it is in commission, so yes, people do still serve on the Constitution. But so, for instance, you've got this Marine Corps bracelet. Might there be a time when the character needed to hide it? And the
Yeah.
thought of why they're hiding it and how they're doing it ends up on the page.
Yep.
You can, if you're doing it looking on, people can be offended or intrigued by the thing they see on someone else. Is there too much jewelry? Are 4 strands of pearls really necessary? You bring it in that way. All such things need to be brought in because they irritate somebody or they intrigue somebody or they threaten somebody. That's how you do it.
And I think that also answers the second question I had, which is that I don't think you're suggesting that people give like exhaustive descriptions of what people are wearing, but rather pick out one or maybe two meaningful things, meaningful details that's going to illustrate the point or the character or whatever you're trying to achieve.
Right. And not to be doing it for every character, too. So a necklace for this character, the gait with which they walk for that character, something about the clothing for the other character. So it's minimal and it's not like repetitive. When you're writing your first draft, there's a tendency to describe every character in the same way. It's a little, we get into the checklists, the 7 things, the cuteness factor, the height, the weight, the eye color, almost all of which is meaningless and should be left out in the rewrite. But what is it you want to reveal about that character? Find a thing or a behavior that will reveal it, or that actually seems to contradict it. Because revealing that it's a contradiction, that you misunderstood so and so because of the thing that was pinned to their hat, that it's a tiny little plot thing, but it's revelatory. Everything you put in the story should mean something.
Yeah.
I do not want to know the walls are beige if it's not going to kill somebody. And
Yeah, I think that this isn't really. I'm going to ask this quickly because it is not really real world building. Well, I guess it kind of is, but I just had the experience of reading an author I love, whose craft skills I'm a huge fan of. But I think that the only thing that ever tripped me up about this author's writing was that I was reading along. It was very character driven, and I was maybe 3/4 of the way through, and she mentioned someone's having very dark hair, like black hair, and I thought it threw me because for whatever reason, up until that moment, I pictured them as having blonde or red hair. And it just took me out of the story for a minute where I was going, "Yeah, oh, wait, black hair?"
And that's one of the you hear people say, "Oh, you have to describe them so they'll picture them." But the truth is the reader's gonna picture them anyway.
Yeah.
And if you throw them a curveball like that, it will be disruptive.
Mhm.
And so you need to be careful. It's one of the reasons why there's tends to be a physical description right at the beginning, so that short circuit that by giving a description. But it's also tedious to have every character being physically described when it doesn't matter to the scene that you're in. We judge people in an instant when we meet them. And it's utterly unfair, but we do it. It's a defense mechanism. That's what you need to have the character do. Respond to them as a reaction, not as a description. Did this person make them feel comfortable immediately? Did it make their back straighten up immediately? Did their hackles rise?
I like that example of the 4th strand of pearls, like someone saying, "She came in, sat down at the table at the country club. Was that 4th strand of pearls really necessary?" Would be a cool way to
Yeah,
achieve, I think, just what you're saying.
yeah. And because that, first of all, it characterizes two characters.
Yeah,
It characterizes the person with the strand of pearls, but also the voice that is analyzing those pearls,
yeah,
right? And that's efficient work. That's
yeah,
what you're after.
yeah. So I'm gonna take us back. I mean, I think world building character building is part of world building, but I wanna make sure that we have time to get to some of the things that we're talking about that are more, I guess, setting or chronology establishing. And I love the fact that you called what you do play search. Just talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, and so there's research, the stuff where you know you have a particular question that needs to be answered, and so you have to home in on the right era or the right country or whatever, and some of that can be a little tedious. But a lot of what I do is to generate ideas, and it's less attached to the particular era. So, for instance, I write science fiction, right? It is handy for me to look at, for instance, the 1886 Bloomingdale's Illustrated Catalog, all right? Because that's a whole nother century. And you open it up, and there are all these things that nobody has anymore. And or where the equivalent is really quite unlike this. And for a science fiction setting, I can look at 1886 and go, okay, that's already changed. How will it change again by the time it's in my story? So I'm looking at 1886 and figuring out 2086. And with a catalog, you've got hundreds of items. So you kind of just flip through and find something that goes, oh, that's weird. Oh, that a reader would get a kick out of that. Yeah, that's what you're looking for, a hook,
Yeah.
right? Something that would be appropriate for a character or a situation, and it's a hook, and you wouldn't have thought about it if you had to flip through the thing. So I'm playing, right?
Yeah.
That's the basic idea.
And when you're doing something like that, let's say you're writing the story in the era 1886, and you found that thing and you're writing about it, or do you have tips for how to write about it? And assuming this isn't a time travel, it's not like somebody from current day going back. But how do you write about it in a way that illustrates the differentness to a current reader without making it clear that you're talking about it from a current person point of view that would be like appropriate for a person in that era to note.
Yeah, and that's one of the things. There are things that go without saying in a culture, and as we know from history, we often wish somebody had explained to us. Iceland, settled by petty kings and slaves. 100 years later, it's a republic. How did that happen? They didn't write it down. We don't know. And so so the way you introduce the thing that no one would say is you have it fail for some reason. And by discussing the exception, someone's because you'll be offended if the rules don't hold, right? And being offended reveals what the rules are. So you do it backhanded. If the reader needs to know it, that's how you do it. You get somebody upset by the fact that it's not working. Oh, now it's working. Okay. Now we know what the rules are. Another thing is language. You should get a book from the time. This catalog, for instance, it's full of jargon. It's full of phrases that we would go, what is that? Or we might actually have to look it up. Those lexical items reveal the era. So you grab those. There are also, my wife gave me an old Baedeker guide to London, right? Well, there are a lot of travel guides around from the last couple of centuries. And one of the ways to get a taste of the language and what was interesting at the time is to get a used copy of one of these things and look in it for what they're intrigued by and how they say it. Because a few period phrases makes the reader go there.
When I was working on my second Anne Kinnear novel, has a backstory that takes place in Maine in 1947, and I was able to find on eBay a travel guide to Maine, like an advertising brochure from like the year before for Mount Desert Island where this took place. It was super fun because I could say they drove past the hotel at the corner of Eden and something that isn't there anymore. And I think that people who live there get the kick out like, oh, is that what used to be there? But yeah, that is super fun.
Yeah.
You would also mention things like postcards, are especially kind of like travel related postcards is a fun.
Yeah, I'm going to suggest that people pay more attention to museums and antique shops. A thing that antique stores tend to have is little bins full of old postcards, which are worth sorting through because they tell you what people were interested in, and some of them are going to be a surprise. And frequently, it's not the main thing they're portraying, but what that car looks like that's parked next to it, or the outfit that gal in the front is wearing. What the heck is that? You're not actually looking for the main thing. You're looking for any detail that sparks. And it's just, you flip through those, boy, there's a lot of story potential. When I was teaching story writing to undergraduates, I dealt postcards to the room. Write a story about the thing in your postcard, because they can be a great spark. The old photographs as well. He waves. I had found this little book, Glimpses of the World's Fair. This is the Chicago White City World's Fair. And it's just photographs, but it's a completely different world. And there are lots of details in it that are fascinating. But frequently in antique stores and used bookstores, there are just sort of random photographs. You won't even know who the people are, but there might be a story in those. I have a friend who's a historian who got an entire career out of a single photograph, and brought her to tell the story of the Czech Legion in World War I. And I remember that because the same thing can happen with fiction. And I got a satire column out of a photograph long ago that it was a picture of a year and a half old boy popping out of a cardboard box, and he was next to a tropical looking shrubbery. And I wrote a column about how people were shipping their children to Africa for cheap daycare learning another language, learning another culture, and they just mailed the kids. Here's the latest popping out of a box. And I ended up with a satire column career out of that photograph. So
Wow.
they
That would
can,
be very fun, even if you don't intend to do anything with it, just as a writing exercise. That kind of thing can be very fun.
yeah. And cycling back, as we were talking about things that I find missing in fiction, adornments is one of them, but the small tools that everybody uses, the things that are on your dressing table, the things that are on your desk, the things that are in the office drawer, the things that people used every day tend not to come up.
Yeah.
He reaches across and he has an eraser, which are becoming very rare because people don't use pencils and they don't use the kind of pen that this works on. They used to be utterly vital. I mean, and I'm assuming in science fiction, they're going to go away because they're messy.
Yeah, I think that those sometimes the more common things are hard to describe because they're not the focus of things like postcards. And I had a lot of fun. It must have been at the same time I was working on this book from 1947. And if you go onto eBay, you can do things like a certain era and ephemera. So I
Right.
was saying like World War II ephemera, and pretty soon you send them $10 or whatever, and pretty soon an envelope shows up that has like ration coupons and letters from overseas soldiers. And one of them had this little pamphlet called like what to do after a soldier is discharged. They're fast. Talk about a time suck.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. And I do collect some of those. You're reminding me that when our soldiers in the First and Second World War were shipped overseas, they were put on a ship for days, if not weeks at a time. And the ship had a little printing office that printed a little booklet telling you how to behave on the ship. So I've got a guide to the USS North Carolina, which was a battleship, but it was big. It could accommodate lots of people. So they were using it to ship people. And so this is where you can be and where you can't be and how to behave and who to salute and who not to salute and all that stuff, where the movie theater is. And well, a number of those details are things you might not have thought of, right? And it still happens, and I expect it happens in science fictional future. And those are the things that they're ephemera. We forget about them. And so we don't put them in the future, for instance, and we forget what was important in the Middle Ages.
It would be fun for a future set story to look at something you're getting on the intergalactic battleship or whatever, and you look at the booklet about who people should and shouldn't be saluting on the battleship that you were talking about and say, oh, well, that would like that translates, you could translate that almost
Right.
exactly
Exactly.
into a future setting.
Except that it won't be a booklet. It'll be something that's put in their chip, right? It'll be
Right.
speaking in their ear. Don't salute him.
Or
Uh,
even just the idea of somebody needing to know, be directed like that. Even
right.
if you're not talking about the communication mechanism for it, you could say, oh, I can imagine a scene where somebody fails to salute someone they should, or
Exactly. Exactly. And I can imagine a crisis in which that system breaks down
yeah,
when somebody needs to get from A to B and the booklet is not working.
yeah. And
That's,
you could base that on find the comparable story of something that happened on a World War II battleship when that did break down and generalize that forward.
yeah.
Were there other things that you find missing that you'd like to mention, encourage people to focus on?
The things that divide us physically from each other, which is something we tend to just assume our own standards. But 100 years ago, in this house, the room I'm in was the servants' quarters. You would have had maids and probably a cook and so forth in if you had been the owner here, or you would have been a maid or a cook or the person who drove the car. I am really annoyed by all the medieval fantasies and historicals that I read where people have privacy. especially the royals. The thing about royalty is you never left them alone. You even frankly, there would be 10 people in the room all night long. The television dramas where people sneak off to have an affair. No, you have an affair and only about 100 people know. It's secret, but, no, it's not really secret. You could not even defecate as a king by yourself. There would be servants that brought you the chamber pot and servants who carried it away and a doctor who looked at it, because the king was the state and was yes, they are really just organized crime in person, but they're also theoretically God's representative. And if they are assassinated, this is a bad thing. So you have them surrounded by guards, and you have them surrounded by guards that cover all the factions so that nobody's feeling driven out of the court, even though they're not your favorite faction. You have potential assassins keeping eyes on potential assassins. Yeah, it's just kind of bizarre. And there just isn't the concept of privacy. So that's, if even in our current decade, if you go to a crowded country like China or Japan, how people treat each other and whether the doors lock and how thick the walls are is quite different. Have a lot of privacy, relatively speaking, in America, and our walls tend to be thick. In Japan, they have no privacy and the walls are paper.
I just had a conversation. I was just in Missouri at a conference, and I was sitting with a group of people mainly from the Midwest, and we were chatting about differences. I'm from Philadelphia, so we were talking about that. And somebody said she was surprised. She had been to New York City and surprised at how few people would make eye contact. And I was like, yeah, because imagine walking down the street in New York City and you try to make eye contact with every person you walk by, it would be overwhelming. Just as you're saying, that's what barriers do you erect when you're going to pass 1,000 people on your way to work versus if you're going to pass 12 people on your way to work.
Yeah, it is quite different. I've been amused by the studies that revealed that city density tells you how fast people will walk, and that it seems to be independent of culture. So it's the same in Asia as it is in Europe. The more people there are, the faster you walk.
Yeah, because it's not possible to have even a fleeting connection with all those people. And so you kind of don't have incentive to tarry.
Right. Yeah, and there's less friction. Yeah. You're less likely to be distracted by so-and-so. And there's also a bit of pressure. It's like, oh, there are a lot of people on the sidewalk. I better get off.
Yeah.
And I would have thought that culture would have had a big effect on this, but it seems not to.
Well, one of the other things that you talked about, I think this is kind of a nice lead into this, is the idea of architecture and also of maps. So I had to set aside some time to talk about maps because I'm a huge map fan. There used to be, as you found out by looking at an old episode of the podcast, my recording room used to be swapped around, and I used to have 2 nautical maps behind me. Now they're in front of me, so I can see them even though the viewers can't. But what are some of the things you found in your book research in terms of either the setting in terms of the architecture of a building or the setting in terms of geographic?
Let's get back to playsearch on this, because I use it. This is one of the things I use if I'm stuck, if I'm getting writer's block, if I'm freezing up. There are certain kinds of books that I just leaf through because they will actually be full of ideas if I have a single operating brain cell. And architecture is one of my favorite things. So, for instance, I have this book of Victorian grand houses, right? And we mostly don't live like this anymore. Uh, or we've turned them into museums. There's one of these, the Henry Clay Frick's Clayton. It's about 6 blocks from me. It's a wonderful museum. But various things about them tell you how different the culture was. And you start imagining what it would be like to live there. And again, you can look at this and think, well, what would the Roman equivalent be? Or what would the future equivalent be? Or what is it like now? It's a springboard for inspiration for a completely different period. And architecture has meaning. One of the things about this Victorian stuff, especially like the Queen Anne, is that money was ostentatious, and it was ostentatious by adding detail. We can afford to have all this bric-a-brac on the house to show off how well off we are. And we don't do that now. Well, one of the reasons we don't do it is Frank Lloyd Wright, who gave us a whole different thing. And I've got books of his stuff. And just flipping through it, it puts you in different places. It makes you think of different things and peoples and ways to be. I also love maps. So I have this history of London in maps. And well, it's been useful, especially with students who are setting things in London. I can look it up. And I have helped correct or relocate all sorts of things. But again, it's one where you flip through and you go, oh, right. I haven't talked about anything like this in my book. Yeah, what's it like to walk along the street where my characters are? I haven't said. Yeah, we forget to have them walk around. We forget to have them look at their own landscapes, right? And map books help with that.
Yeah, I found one oops that some research avoided for me was that I had picked an actual street to set a fictional house on for my book that had some historical background. And it was only during the research process that I learned that because of the fire that had swept through, what was a through street now was not a through street at the time. It was a street that you could only approach from one side. So I would have had all sorts of historical society people up in arms if I had caught that.
Yeah, I caught something that actually saved me from being repetitious, and it's kind of silly. I'll try to say it quickly. So I'm a big fan of Sherlock Holmes. I have the annotated Sherlock Holmes, and I have the maps and I'm also a big fan of James Joyce. And had been reading in Ulysses and realized that some of the street names were the same as in London. And yeah, it was an empire, and they tended to rename streets after streets in the main capital. And I thought, what would be cool would be to write a Sherlock Holmes pastiche, as it were, set in Dublin, but only using streets that occur in Sherlock Holmes. So great. So I started taking notes to do that. And then I was working a student job. I was working dusting shelves in the library. That was a bad idea. And I came across James Joyce's Dublin, and it had a map that was deliberately only the streets that Joyce named, not the ones that were in the story, but the ones he named. And I looked at that map, and it was my list, which made me realize that this is a great idea. James Joyce already did it. Ulysses it's actually a study at Scarlet.
Interesting.
And the Bloom's house is on Baker Street.
No kidding.
Yeah.
Oh, that's fun.
Yeah.
So I guess that you set aside your pastiche or you went ahead with it?
I put it aside. And then later, it was funny. Later, there's a book called Naked is the Best Disguise. And it was an author who was revealing the hidden symbolism of Sherlock Holmes. And he had caught that James Joyce was using it. And he had this long list of evidence, none of which was the long list of evidence that I had. So I was just repeatedly confirming that it's like, oh, okay, yeah, I might have embarrassed myself by doing something that the other people have already seen. But here's an example of one of the ways you could get secret meaning into a story is to use a map of someplace else and superimpose it on your story and not tell anybody. But you'll know, right?
Yeah.
You'll know that when they turn onto that street it would really be so-and-so, and the cenotaph is there or something. And I will tell you that secret symbolism and secret meaning seems to elevate a story, and you do this without expecting the reader to ever know. It organizes thoughts and meaning in your mind, and it pays off.
I really like that idea of using an actual place, but fictionalizing the names, for example, because that just has the practical benefit of keeping you honest and keeping you on top of your own world. And you don't have to be going, oh no, now I have to go back to book 3 and remind myself of whether the bakery was next to the post office or not. The other thing that just popped into my head, and I wish I had examples of all these books, as my listeners know, we recently had a flood in my house and all my books are kind of packed up. Otherwise, I would have brought this along. But I have a book in a box somewhere, safe, that is called, I think, Daily Life in Art. And it is just, as I recall, because I read this years ago, it was like famous paintings, but they've zoomed in on a particular aspect of it that is strictly to illustrate, like, this is how they made bread, or this is what a salt shaker looked like. And that kind of stuff is a cool resource as well.
Yeah, yeah, and you don't have to give all 24 steps of a process. Just mentioning the process and showing 1 or 2 steps makes the world more real. Characters who have to wait for their food and watch something happening is an opportunity to tell us a lot about the culture without going on and on or manufacturing a whole scene. It's just, no, make them have to wait. There's a level of frustration there, and they'll notice something that they wouldn't have noticed otherwise.
Yeah, I really like the examples. I mean, several of the examples you've given are focused on the power of focusing on the exceptions to the rule, the power of focusing on the one illustrative thing that is going to represent more.
Right.
And so one of my questions was going to be, how do you know how much when you've gone overboard? And I think you've answered that. But I wanted to ask a different question, which is, when you're doing this research, knowing that we have a finite amount of time to do this stuff, do you have advice for people about when can they stop? I mean, they might continue researching just because they think it's fascinating, but what is a red flag that says, okay, now maybe you've gone like a little too far down the rabbit hole?
Yeah. Well, one thing, let me say about research, we tend to tell ourselves we have to do the research first. And I say, no, write the story first, then research the things you need. It's fine to be reading about the culture that you're writing in, for instance, or the period, but don't start studying the details of how cabins are on ships if it turns out none of your characters get within 100 miles of the sea, right? It might be interesting, but it won't be useful. The story is going to occur independently, and then you do the world building to emphasize and illustrate the story. So go ahead and write the story, put a little square brackets and saying, you need to find out if such a thing actually existed. Go on. Now, how much to put in, which is one of the ways to know when you're done, depends on which audience you're writing for. And I won't go on and on about this, but basically there are 2 audience groupings. And of course, individual people read both. But in science fiction, I called one side rubber suit science fiction and the other side kitchen sink science fiction. In fantasy, I call it medieval inns and McCastles fantasy or historical and whole new culture. It's a spectrum. But using the rubber suits, there are folks who they want their science fiction to actually be simple. Westerns in space, detective stories in space, melodramas in space. And they want everything to be just like it is now with one cool gadget. And the original Star Trek was pretty much like this. There were aliens and they were interesting, but they were people in rubber suits. And there were the 4 science fiction devices of Star Trek in every episode. And that was about it. And those readers they want to be intrigued, but they don't want to be challenged. are reading for relaxation, typically, they don't want to have to rethink the culture. And then there's the folks who they want to be immersed in someplace completely different. And so with rubber suit medieval inn folks, you want the one thing that you're going to focus on, the one world building nexus. And that's pretty much it. You don't want to overdo. So if you're starting to work on your third one, you've gone too far. For the more immersive folks, the first thing you want to do is not start at the beginning, but start in the middle. Drop them into the whatever it is. Have a lot of stuff going by that's interesting, but you don't explain, but you convince them they're in a whole different world, and then show them crucial things at intervals so the world keeps kind of growing on them as you're world building. With that set of folks, it can be easy to just get lost in adding things. And the way to know that you're not helping is if you're not adding meaning. If you're just coming up with another cool description, it's time to quit. Only if you're adding plot complexity in an interesting way or meaning should a thing be in there.
So I'm guessing that like Tolkien would be an example of the second one. Am I understanding correctly?
Yeah, he was immersive, but he was also very careful in how he revealed the world. He did it one step at a time. The hobbits are an English village with like 2 interesting details. And then somebody passes through, and that's interesting, and we deal with that. And then, okay, we're going to have to we need to go on this expedition, and there are going to be actual elves. And we have an interaction with elves, and the world gets bigger. And then we move along, and the world gets bigger. But it was done stage by stage, not pouring it all on top of you. And one of the things with people thinking of Tolkien is we think of all the research he did, all the world building he did that he didn't put in the book. And we imagine that it's in the book, and it's not. No, what's in the book is the flavor of it. Because he knew all that stuff, he wrote with authority about what wasn't being shown. You knew there was something big over that mountain ridge, but he didn't have time to tell you, so you never found out. But you knew it was there, right? And weak writing implies there's nothing beyond the mountain if you haven't been told. That authority comes from believing what you've put in your book or put in your story. And that's a real key. I should add that there's a psychological way to tell if you've gone too far, and that's if you start to hate the story. Because I learned kind of amusingly at one point that I had a bunch of stories on the shelf because I'd gotten sick of them, and so I shelved them. And when I decided, let me just take them off the shelf and put them in circulation, they sold at the same rate as the things I thought were great. And it occurred to me that the reason I hated them was there wasn't anything else to do to them, that I was just changing the logo on the deck chairs. And so psychologically, if you're shelving a story because you are just tired of it, it's probably tired of you, and you should send it to editors and quit fiddling with it.
Well, that is all lovely advice. And Timons, I think that we're kindred spirits, and we could probably extend this episode for another several hours if we had the time. But it's been so lovely talking to you, and I appreciate all the tips that you've shared about world building and finding the small stuff. So please let everyone know where they can go to find out more about you and everything you do online.
Well, I have a Vestigial X account. I do have a web page. It needs work, but it's www.timonsesaias.com. You can ask to be a Facebook friend, but just Google my name, and it's me and a Swedish theologian that will show up. And I write short fiction, so I'm all over the place.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for having me.
I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Timons. Which of his tips were your favorite? If you tried it out, I would love to hear the result. Just leave a comment on YouTube, and while you're at it, please subscribe. And if you got value from this episode and were thinking, I wish I could buy Matty a cup of coffee, you can do that. Scroll to the bottom of any page at theindyauthor.com and click Buy Me a Coffee. Until next time, here's wishing you favorable winds and smooth sailing on your creative voyage.